When GBUSH locked in on Jason Lloyd's EPA argument, it was a direct challenge to the foundation of modern football punditry. Metrics like expected points added are often seen as gospel in debates, but GBUSH made it clear. If the numbers don't reflect what's actually happening on the field, they're irrelevant. He highlighted how Shedeur Sanders has shown elite-level instincts, navigating collapsing pockets, staying composed, and executing clean reads, even without the benefit of solid offensive line or system. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. BLASTS' critique wasn't casual. It was a direct confrontation to the assumptions that analysts like Lloyd lean on too easily. What made this confrontation powerful wasn't just a dismantling of stats. It was a clarity of what matters: performance under pressure. In defending Sanders, GBUSH elevated the conversation to something bigger than one quarterback. He made the case that evaluation must start with film, with poise, and with context, not blind faith in numbers that missed a point. This didn't start as a disagreement. It started as another routine football conversation that was supposed to follow the usual script. Numbers get thrown out, metrics get flexed, someone nods along, then everyone moves on. But this time, GBUSH wasn't playing along. From the jump, his frustration was clear, and it wasn't emotional noise. It was controlled, deliberate, and aimed directly at how Shedeur Sanders was being discussed. GBUSH made it clear that the conversation had drifted too far away from football itself. Not theory, not spreadsheets. Football. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't posturing. He was laying the groundwork for a takedown built on one simple idea. Quarterbacks are evaluated on what they do on the field, not what someone's favorite stat says they should be doing. He framed the entire discussion around one issue: context. If you remove context, you can make any quarterback look bad or elite. And according to GBUSH, that's exactly what was happening with Shedeur. Jason Lloyd came into the conversation armed with credibility and numbers. EPA, efficiency, comparisons, the kind of metrics that sound authoritative enough to end debates before they start. His stance was clear. The data didn't support the idea that Sanders was performing at a high level. That, in his view, should have been the end of it. But that's where the disconnect formed. Lloyd wasn't attacking Sanders personally. He was leaning on reputation and established analytical frameworks. The problem, as GBUSH pointed out in real time, was that those frameworks weren't telling the full story. They were stripping away pressure situations, offensive line breakdowns, and situational football. The more Lloyd leaned on numbers, the more the gap widened. Because the argument wasn't about whether analytics have value. It was about whether they should override what's plainly visible on film. Lloyd doubled down on metrics as a measuring stick. GBUSH was waiting for that. When Shedeur Sanders entered the conversation, even indirectly, the tone shifted. GBUSH redirected everything back to the tape. Pocket presence, decision-making, poise. These weren't abstract traits. They were visible. Sanders wasn't panicking under pressure. He wasn't bailing clean pockets unnecessarily. He was standing in, reading defenses, and making throws that required timing and confidence. GBUSH emphasized that Sanders was doing this despite limited experience and difficult conditions. This wasn't a quarterback being protected by an elite offensive line or simplified reads. This was a young quarterback operating in imperfect situations and still showing control. What stood out wasn't just the physical ability. It was composure. Sanders wasn't rattled by criticism. He wasn't shrinking when things broke down. According to GBUSH, that matters more than any metric because it translates directly to Sundays. This is where the debate turned. GBUSH didn't dismiss analytics outright. He dismantled their misuse. He explained that EPA doesn't account for missed blocks, blown assignments, or play calls that set a quarterback up to fail. He argued that numbers without film are just noise. And he did it calmly. That was the part that landed hardest. No theatrics, no shouting, just point after point that exposed how shallow reputation-based arguments can be when they aren't backed by actual football analysis. GBUSH questioned why Sanders was being evaluated differently, why patience existed for some quarterbacks but not others. Why's struggle was framed as development for some, but as failure for Sanders. He didn't accuse. Lloyd pushed back by leaning on history and precedent. Cleveland quarterbacks have failed before. Metrics have predicted outcomes accurately in the past. These weren't unreasonable points, but they weren't answers to what was happening on the field right now. The issue wasn't Cleveland's past. It was Sanders' present. Lloyd's argument relied on generalized outcomes. GBUSH kept dragging it back to specifics. Reads made, pressure navigated, throws delivered. As the exchange continued, it became clear that Lloyd was defending a system of evaluation, not necessarily the play itself. That distinction mattered, because the moment the system couldn't explain what the film showed, the system started. Sanders' response to criticism became a central point. GBUSH highlighted how Sanders didn't retreat into safe play. He didn't lose confidence. He continued to operate like a quarterback who believed he belonged on the field. That confidence wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It showed up in mechanics and decision-making, in knowing when to throw the ball away, in knowing when to step up, in understanding timing. GBUSH argued that these are traits you either see or you don't. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Metrics might lag behind. Narratives might resist. But the film doesn't lie. By this point, the conversation wasn't really about Sanders anymore. It was about control of the narrative. GBUSH framed it as a larger issue in NFL coverage. Who gets the benefit of doubt and who doesn't? He pointed out that relying on recycled talking points is easier than adjusting opinions based on new evidence. And that's why moments like this matter. Live debates strip away prepared narratives. They force real answers. GBUSH didn't declare Sanders a finished product. He didn't promise stardom. He made a narrower, more defensible claim. Sanders is showing legitimate quarterback traits, and dismissing that because of selective metrics is lazy analysis. The Cleveland context loomed over everything. A franchise marked by instability at quarterback. That history weighed heavily on the discussion, but GBUSH argued it shouldn't be used as a shortcut to judgment. Sanders operating with poise in that environment mattered. It suggested growth where failure used to be assumed. It suggested that maybe evaluation methods needed to change before the quarterback did. The debate ended without a neat resolution, but the point was made. Film matters. Context matters. And confidence backed by performance is harder to dismiss than reputation-backed opinions. If you watched that exchange and felt the shift, you weren't alone. Let us know what you saw on the field, where you stand on film versus metrics, and how you think young quarterbacks should be evaluated. If you're enjoying these breakdowns, make sure to like the video, share it with other football fans, comment your take, and subscribe so you don't miss the next. Jason Lloyd didn't back down, but the cracks were there. As GBUSH kept steering the conversation toward specifics, actual plays, actual games, real moments under real pressure, Lloyd's reliance on EPA and reputational inertia started to sound more like a defense mechanism than a football take. He started defaulting to what had worked in the past. Historically, guys with Sanders' EPA don't pan out. The numbers don't lie. But GBUSH had already dismantled the core of that position. The numbers weren't lying, but they also weren't telling the truth. Not the full truth. Not when Sanders' supporting cast was collapsing, when his offensive line was folding like lawn chairs, and when he was still making tight window throws look routine. By the end of Lloyd's, it wasn't just about EPA anymore. It was about credibility. And when GBUSH pressed him point to the actual plays, named the misreads, showed the panic, explained the lack of NFL traits, there was silence. Metrics couldn't answer that, and that silence said more than a spreadsheet ever could. You saw it on tape. Shedeur Sanders, standing in collapsing pockets, keeping his eyes downfield, shifting subtly instead of running blindly, making throws off-platform with timing that didn't reflect a rookie. That's what GBUSH was pointing to, and it wasn't speculation. It was film. The moments that stuck out weren't the flashy highlights. They were the controlled ones. A third-and-long conversion with pressure in his face. A sideline throw against tight coverage that only his receiver could reach. A pump fake to move a safety and open up a seam route. These weren't moments of luck. They were decisions rooted in real quarterbacking instincts. And it's not that GBUSH was calling Sanders elite. He was calling him legit. Someone who could grow into a top-tier NFL quarterback if given real evaluation, not shortcuts, not narrative laziness, not the just another Cleveland guy tag. That kind of poise doesn't show up in EPA, but it shows up on game day. That's what pushed GBUSH over the edge. This idea that Shedeur was being boxed into a category he didn't belong in because someone didn't want to watch the film. That's when he hit his stride. Calm, sharp, and cutting through the noise. He laid out the hypocrisy. Other young QBs with worse stats were getting excused because of potential. But Shedeur, the son of Deion Sanders, carrying a spotlight and still outperforming expectations, he was getting picked apart like he had something to prove every single week. And when GBUSH said, "You're not watching the game," it didn't come off as petty. It came off like a mirror being held up. He wasn't just challenging Jason Lloyd. He was calling out an entire mode of sports commentary that leans on analytics as a shield instead of a tool. That's the difference. GBUSH wasn't anti-stats. He was anti-lazy. And that distinction, Sanders, for his part, never flinched. On or off the field, his demeanor matched the film. Composed, confident, unbothered. When asked about criticism, he didn't go off. He just said the tape speaks for itself. And the tape did. That maturity is rare, especially in a media landscape built for hot takes and reaction clips. But Sanders kept showing the kind of mental toughness that translates to leadership. Teammates responded to it. Coaches trusted it. And while some analysts might have missed it, GBUSH didn't. He pointed to Sanders' situational awareness, his ability to adjust protections, his recognition of disguised coverages. All subtle, all coachable, but all already there. You don't fluke your way into that kind of feel for the game, especially not in a dysfunctional setup like Cleveland's offense has been. BUSH's bottom line? You can critique Sanders' stats all you want. Just don't do it without watching him. Lloyd made one last push, circling back to reputation. He said Sanders hadn't earned the trust yet, that Cleveland had been burned too many times by guys who looked the part early and fell off. It wasn't personal, he claimed. It was about not repeating history. But GBUSH didn't let that slide. He said that logic was how you end up missing the next great quarterback. Evaluating talent isn't about avoiding disappointment. It's about recognizing growth when it's happening and not clinging to ghosts of the past. He called out the double standard again, how some quarterbacks get years to figure out, while Sanders was being dissected 6 games in. And when Lloyd leaned back on he hasn't done enough, GBUSH it back with, done enough for who? Because if you're only measuring by EPA, you're not really measuring quarterbacking. You're just counting. The real shift happened when GBUSH reframed the entire debate. It's not about whether Shedeur Sanders is perfect. It's whether he's being evaluated fairly. And once you ask that question, the rest falls apart. He compared the criticism Sanders got to the excuses made for other QBs in similar or worse situations. Same pressure, same bad lines, same early mistakes, but different reactions. And that's where media bias shows itself. Not always in what's said, but in what isn't. He brought it back to reality. How many quarterbacks, under that much scrutiny, still come out each week composed, focused, and visibly improving? Not many. But Sanders was doing it. The deeper the conversation went, the more obvious it became. The media wasn't just underestimating Sanders. It was refusing to let go of a script that didn't match the film. The game footage didn't care about anyone's reputation. It showed Sanders under duress, making good decisions. Not every throw was perfect. Not every drive was clean. But the trajectory was there. You could see a quarterback learning on the fly, adjusting mid-game, improving weekly. That's what GBUSH kept bringing up. Not potential. Production. Not hype. Habits. He talked about Sanders' footwork improving since week 1, about his pocket timing becoming more consistent, about the difference between surviving and commanding a drive, and how Sanders was moving from the former to the latter. These are details analysts should catch. But if all you're doing is scanning box scores and referencing EPA, you'll miss them. And in that gap between perception and reality, careers can get mislabeled. GBUSH was fighting to keep that from happening. Not just for Sanders, but for the idea that actual plays should still matter more than spreadsheet assumptions. This wasn't just about one quarterback. It was about Cleveland, a team that's burned through promising names like a reality show burns through contestants. And in that context, you'd think the media would be cautious before writing someone off too early. But that's what GBUSH was pushing back against. This obsession with the past, this fear of hope, this refusal to see progress when it's right in front of you. He said it flat out. You can't hold a quarterback hostage to what happened with the last guy. And he was right. Sanders isn't playing in 2016. He's playing right now. And right now, he's showing signs of something Cleveland hasn't had in a long time. Stability. By the end of the question wasn't whether Sanders was perfect. It was whether Cleveland and its media was finally ready to break its own cycle of doubt. By this point, Jason Lloyd's playbook was worn thin. The numbers had been quoted. The historical context had been cited. But there was no new ground being broken, just recycled doubt aimed at a quarterback who hadn't conformed to old expectations. His fallback was predictability. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's early. We've seen flashes before. These lines weren't just tired. They were evasive. And GBUSH called it out. He didn't need hypotheticals. He had tape. He had plays. And most importantly, he had real-time growth. Lloyd kept trying to insert control into the conversation by shifting focus back to the past. But every time he did, it looked more like a reluctance to acknowledge what was unfolding right in front of him. That Shedeur Sanders was doing something Cleveland quarterbacks rarely do, demanding respect with his game, not his name. And for someone who supposedly valued data, Lloyd's refusal to incorporate film into his analysis said a lot. Maybe the real numbers he didn't want to face were the ones playing out live on. What kept elevating the debate was Shedeur himself, the way he carried himself in pressers. No defensiveness, no panic, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what he did right, what he needed to work on, and how he approached the game. He was never reactive. Even when the media tried to bait him, Sanders didn't feed the narrative machine. He stuck to football. We just need to clean up protection. I could have gotten the ball out quicker. That's on me. I'll fix it. These weren't rehearsed PR lines. They were quarterback lines. And that maturity? That's what GBUSH kept returning to. It wasn't just the physical tools. It was the way Sanders handled adversity. The way he led when everything else was unstable. He didn't need a perfect setup to operate. He just needed a chance. And if you watched him closely, it was obvious. He was making the most of it. GBUSH didn't let the moment pass. He took the whole conversation and zoomed out. This wasn't just about correcting Jason Lloyd. It was about correcting the system that made Lloyd's argument so common. He explained that this is how narratives get built. A player doesn't fit the mold. The numbers don't paint the full picture. But instead of reassessing the method, the media doubles down on the method. And when the method fails, the player gets blamed. That's what he refused to let happen to Shedeur Sanders. Not on his watch. Not when there was visible proof, drive after drive, that Sanders was making NFL-level decisions under pressure. GBUSH said it outright. We've been burned in the past, sure. But if we keep evaluating scared, we'll never see what's right in front of us. And no one could argue with that. The Cleveland quarterback graveyard is long. Johnny Manziel, Deshaun Kaiser, Brandon Whedon. It's easy to see why people cling to pessimism like a safety blanket. But that mindset is also what buries growth before it can bloom. And that's what GBUSH was pushing against. He wasn't promising that Shedeur would be the one. He was saying the signs are there, and they're stronger than most want to admit. Because it's easier to believe in failure when you've seen it over and over again. But Sanders didn't look like the others. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't freelancing every snap. He wasn't leaning on athleticism as a crutch. He was playing the position the way it's supposed to be played. Calculated, composed, controlled. And when a quarterback does that in Cleveland, with that pressure, with that baggage, that deserves more than skepticism. It deserves rewatch the tape. The signs are there. Sanders manipulating safeties with his eyes, throwing with anticipation, recognizing blitz packages pre-snap, and adjusting protections. That's not rookie luck. That's quarterback IQ. The narrative that he's just surviving, It doesn't hold up when you see him dissecting zones and throwing receivers open. These aren't fluke plays. They're consistent, replicable reads that show development. And GBUSH made it clear. If Shedeur's name wasn't Sanders, if he wasn't a target for critics trying to score clicks, the conversation would be different. People would be raving about the growth. They'd be talking about potential, not ceilings. But instead, Sanders had to prove more sooner and under harsher scrutiny than most. And that's what GBUSH was refusing to let slide, because no player should have to outperform narrative just to be seen. Lloyd tried to bring the conversation back to objectivity. We're just asking questions. We're just being cautious. But that was a dodge. Caution isn't the same as critique, and just asking questions isn't neutral when it reinforces a biased lens. GBUSH didn't call Lloyd a hater. He didn't make it personal. He made it factual. If you haven't watched the last 3 games, don't tell me he's regressing. That one sentence reset the room. Because this wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about observation. It was about whether the people shaping narratives were even doing the work. And if they weren't, why were they still being treated like experts? That's what GBUSH exposed. Not just Lloyd's take, but the system that lets takes flourish without accountability. Meanwhile, Shedeur kept stacking good habits. The checkdowns when deep shots weren't there. The ability to eat a sack instead of forcing a throw. The subtle improvements that show you someone is learning the pro game in real time. His body language didn't change, even after tough games, even under constant scrutiny. That steadiness, that's what you want from a leader. And if you listen closely during press conferences, he never played the blame game, never threw teammates under the bus, never overhyped a win or overreacted to a loss. Just a steady voice that said, back to work. That consistency, week after week, is what separates flashes from foundation, and GBUSH saw that. BUSH's final point hit hardest. He said what a lot of people have been thinking, but weren't willing to say out loud. Maybe the media doesn't want Shedeur Sanders to succeed. Maybe success means confronting their own blind spots, their own outdated models, their own reluctance to embrace a quarterback who didn't take the traditional path. And when GBUSH said, he's doing everything you ask from a young quarterback, so what's the real problem? That silence in studio spoke volumes, because there wasn't a rebuttal, just the uncomfortable realization that GBUSH wasn't wrong. He wasn't ranting. He was holding a mirror up to the room, and no one liked the reflection. He left it there, not with mic drop, but with a challenge. Watch the games. Then let's talk. If you've been watching, you already know the growth is real. Drop a comment, and let us know what play made you believe. Hit like if you're done with empty stat takes. Share this with someone still clinging to old narratives. And subscribe to stay tapped into every twist and turn.